Stamford Bridge was never simply a clash of armies on a warm September afternoon. It was the final, brutal curtain call for an entire way of waging war, the moment when the old Viking world of raiding fleets, personal glory, and battle axes met a newer world shaped by logistics, forced marches, and the merciless arithmetic of exhaustion and loss. To understand why two kings and thousands of warriors converged on a small crossing in Yorkshire in the autumn of 1066, it helps to step back more than a decade, to a kingdom that looked stable on the surface but was already hollowing out from within. When Edward the Confessor died in January of that year without a son and without a named heir, England did not become dangerous because a king had died. It became dangerous because royal authority itself had been quietly eroding for a generation. Edward had spent much of his youth as an exile in Normandy, and when he finally returned to claim the English throne in 1042, he wore the crown without truly holding the levers of power. Real authority in the kingdom had drifted into the hands of a handful of great noble families, and towering above all of them stood the House of Godwin. Godwin of Wessex had not seized his position through rebellion, he had built it patiently, through loyalty to the Danish kings who once ruled England, through political instinct, and through sheer staying power in a court where rivals rose and fell constantly. By the time he died in 1053, Godwin was no longer merely a wealthy nobleman, he had become, in effect, the load-bearing wall of the entire English state. His son, Harold Godwinson, inherited both the title and the structure his father had built, and Harold's position only grew from there. As Earl of Wessex, he controlled the richest, most strategically vital region of England, and over the following years his brothers were installed as earls in key territories across the realm, until by the early 1060s the Godwin family in practical terms controlled most of the kingdom. They never formally overthrew the crown, they simply made the crown dependent on them, a distinction that mattered enormously to how the succession crisis would later unfold. Harold Godwinson became the true center of gravity in English politics, the man other nobles measured themselves against, and he represented order to those who valued stability, but he also represented a threat to rival families who resented his dominance and to foreign rulers who looked across the Channel and the North Sea and saw a kingdom effectively governed by a man who was king in everything but name. By 1066, three separate men believed the English throne belonged to them, each with a claim built on a different foundation. Harold Godwinson's claim rested on acceptance. When Edward died, the leading nobles of England chose him and he was crowned at Westminster within days. A swift coronation meant to project stability and deny any rival the chance to contest an empty throne. William, Duke of Normandy, built his claim on promise, pointing to Edward's long-standing ties to Normandy and insisting, with the backing of Norman chroniclers, that Harold himself had sworn an oath years earlier, likely under considerable pressure, to support William's bid for the crown during a visit to the continent around 1064. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, built his claim on inheritance and raw force, invoking an old agreement said to exist between a previous King of Norway and a previous King of England, an arrangement holding that if one ruler died without an heir, the other's line would inherit the throne. Hardrada was not a man inclined to wait for lawyers or councils to settle the matter. He possessed a formidable army and decades of hard experience as a professional warrior king who had fought from Byzantium to the frozen edges of the north, and he intended to take by force what he believed was rightfully his. Yet remarkably, the spark that turned this three-way rivalry into an actual invasion did not originate in Normandy or Norway at all. It came from inside England itself, from a family quarrel that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Back in 1055, King Edward had granted the earldom of Northumbria to Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, and Tostig's rule there proved harsh and unpopular. Taxes climbed, political opponents had a troubling habit of disappearing, and resentment built steadily among the northern nobility and common people alike. That same general period saw Tostig entangled in rebellion and exile, and he even went so far as to ally himself at one point with Griffith, the King of Wales and a longtime bitter enemy of Edward's regime, a decision that did lasting damage to his reputation even after a later reconciliation restored him first to the earldom of East Anglia, and then in 1057, to something closer to his father's old position of influence. But the underlying damage to his standing in the north never fully healed, and by the mid-1060s Northumbria rose in open revolt against him a second time. In late 1065, while Tostig happened to be away from his territory, the northern lords rose up, killed his officials, and demanded that he be removed from power permanently. This left Harold Godwinson facing an agonizing choice: back his own brother and risk plunging the kingdom into civil war, or abandon him and preserve what fragile unity England still possessed. Harold chose peace and stability over family loyalty, siding against his brother to keep the kingdom whole. Tostig, humiliated and enraged, chose vengeance instead. He no longer sought to rule England himself, he sought only to make sure Harold lost it, and by inviting a foreign king onto English soil to press his claim, Tostig transformed a domestic political collapse into a full-scale international invasion. Without Tostig's bitterness and his fateful decision to seek out Harald Hardrada, the Viking campaign of 1066 might never have happened at all, and the battle at Stamford Bridge might never have been fought. Harald Hardrada did not sail to England to test some abstract theory of inheritance law. He came to conquer, and he came prepared. By late August of 1066, the Norwegian fleet had crossed the North Sea and made landfall along the coast of Cleveland in the north of England. And from the very first moment the longships appeared, it was clear this was not a stealth operation but a deliberate, terrifying declaration of intent. The town of Scarborough was attacked and burned, not primarily for supplies but for the message the destruction sent up and down the coast. The Vikings had returned, and no one should imagine otherwise. From there, Hardrada sailed his fleet into the Humber estuary, pushing deep into England's interior waterways, and there he joined forces with Tostig Godwinson and the followers Tostig had managed to rally to his cause. Together they commanded a large, veteran army, hardened by years of campaigning. Confident in their own abilities, and far more experienced in pitched battle than most of the English forces they were likely to encounter, their first serious test came quickly. On the 20th of September 1066, near the village of Fulford just south of the city of York, the Norwegian army met a northern English force led by the Earls Edwin and Morcar, young brothers who commanded the levies of their respective territories. The battlefield itself was narrow and unforgiving, hemmed in by the river Ouse on one flank, a swollen tributary called the Germany Beck cutting across the field, and marshland pressing in on both sides, leaving very little room for maneuver. Edwin and Morcar had actually chosen their ground well. If they could hold this constricted position, the city of York behind them would remain safe from the invaders. But discipline broke down at a critical moment. As water levels in the marsh dropped and more solid ground opened up, Morcar spotted Tostig's smaller contingent positioned opposite his own men, and old personal hatred overrode tactical caution. Morcar attacked early, driving Tostig's forces backward and apparently convincing himself that he had broken the enemy line entirely. That single impulsive decision effectively decided the battle before it had truly begun, because Hardrada had been waiting for exactly this kind of overextension, and the moment it came, he struck with devastating precision. The Norwegian king drove his veteran troops forward directly against Edwin's wing, shattering it after brutal, close-quarters hand-to-hand fighting, and with Edwin's line collapsing, Hardrada wheeled the rest of his army south to smash into Morcar's now exposed flank and rear. The English forces broke apart completely under this pressure. Men were cut down as they tried to flee, and others drowned attempting to escape through the surrounding marshes. With the northern English army destroyed, the road to York now lay completely open to the invaders. Within days, the city surrendered, hostages were promised to guarantee its continued cooperation, and supplies were demanded to sustain the victorious army. For the Norwegians and their allies, Fulford represented far more than a single tactical victory. It felt like conclusive proof of something larger. They believed in the aftermath that the north of England was finished as a fighting force, that no English army remained capable of stopping their advance, and that time itself had shifted decisively onto their side. That overconfident belief shaped everything that happened next, and it would prove fatal. Hardrada withdrew a significant portion of his army back toward Rickhall, leaving them stationed with the ships, and then marched toward Stamford Bridge with only a partial force, expecting nothing more dramatic than a routine, peaceful exchange of hostages and provisions from the surrounding countryside. It was late September, the unseasonable heat remained oppressive, and many of the warriors accompanying Hardrada left their armor behind entirely, judging it unnecessary for what they assumed would be an administrative errand rather than a battle. They had already won the major engagement. They had shattered England's northern defenses at Fulford. They simply did not expect to fight again so soon. This assumption turned out to be the single greatest error of the entire campaign. Victory at Fulford had bred overconfidence had bred a dangerous division of forces, and that division opened the door to catastrophe. Yet the truly fatal mistake of the whole invasion was not made on the field at Stamford Bridge itself. It was made in the days immediately following Fulford, when the invaders assumed they had all the time in the world. Harold Godwinson, meanwhile, had been fighting an entirely different kind of war throughout that summer, a war against time and uncertainty rather than against any single enemy army. He had spent months holding the southern coast of England with a substantial force, anxiously waiting for William of Normandy to launch the invasion everyone expected from across the Channel. When no Norman fleet appeared by early autumn, Harold finally dismissed this southern levy, sending the men back to their homes and their harvests, and for a brief moment England seemed to exhale in relief. Then news arrived from the north that the danger had simply shifted direction entirely, and the kingdom's collective breath caught again. Word of the disaster at Fulford reached Harold like a physical blow. York had fallen, the Norwegian army was loose inside his own kingdom, and there was no time left for careful deliberation. Harold did not pause to debate strategy at length, and he did not attempt to negotiate. Instead, he immediately began one of the fastest forced marches recorded anywhere in the medieval world, driving his army north across nearly 300 kilometers of English countryside in a matter of days. Some men rode on horseback while most marched on foot, and virtually everyone involved was pushed well beyond normal human endurance, because for Harold, speed itself had become his primary weapon against an enemy that believed itself safe. On the morning of the 25th of September, Harold's exhausted but rapidly moving army arrived near Stamford Bridge, and the Norwegian forces stationed there were caught completely by surprise. They had genuinely believed no English army could possibly reach them so quickly after Fulford, and they had convinced themselves that the war in the north was already effectively over and won. Harold made his tactical decision immediately upon arrival. He would strike directly at Harald Hardrada's divided force before it had any chance to reunite with the larger contingent still stationed back at Rickall with the ships. This would not be a prolonged siege or a cautious standoff. It would be a swift, decisive strike aimed at removing the enemy's leadership before reinforcements could arrive. When the two armies finally caught sight of one another across the landscape, confusion spread rapidly through the Norwegian ranks. Many of Hardrada's men were entirely unarmored, their helmets left behind with the ships at Rickall, their shields scattered rather than properly formed into a defensive line. Before the first blows of the actual battle were struck, Harold rode forward alone under a flag of truce, and what followed in that brief parley was less an act of diplomacy than a genuine moral crossroads for everyone involved. Harold offered his estranged brother Tostig the return of his former earldom, and beyond that, remarkably, he offered him a full third of the Kingdom of England to govern. Tostig listened carefully to this generous offer, then asked a single pointed question in response. And what would Harold of Norway receive in return for his part in this arrangement? Harold answered without any hesitation whatsoever, telling his brother that the Norwegian king would receive 7 feet of English ground, or more if his height required it. Faced with this stark, contemptuous answer, Tostig ultimately chose loyalty and honor to his foreign ally over any chance of personal survival or reconciliation, and he rejected his brother's offer outright. Harald Hardrada himself did not fully understand the English words being exchanged during this tense negotiation, since he did not speak the language, but he clearly understood the underlying tension, the barely concealed hatred, and the general shape of what was unfolding between the two brothers. The brief parley ended without agreement, and the actual battle began immediately at the bridge itself. Stamford Bridge, as a physical location, was extremely narrow, far too constricted for either army's numerical advantage to matter in the opening moments, and this geography turned it into the critical choke point of the entire engagement. As English troops surged forward to force a crossing, a single Norwegian warrior reportedly stepped onto the bridge alone, wielding a massive two-handed Dane axe, and what followed there entered almost immediately into legend. Blow after blow fell as English soldiers tried repeatedly to force their way across. Shields were split apart under the impact of the axe, and men were cut down or thrown back into the water below. For several critical minutes, this single warrior apparently held back an entire advancing army almost single-handedly, and while the sagas later composed about the battle claimed he personally killed dozens of English soldiers during his stand, a number modern historians consider almost certainly exaggerated for dramatic effect. The underlying tactical reality remains genuinely significant regardless of the exact body count. That one man's stubborn resistance bought precious time for the main Norwegian force to organize a proper shield wall on the far bank of the river, and eventually, after sustained pressure, the bridge itself was taken by the English, allowing Harold's army to cross and the main phase of the battle to truly begin. Once across, the English found the Norwegian shield wall stretched dangerously thin across the open field beyond the bridge, spread too wide and too shallow to hold firm against sustained pressure, and compounded further by the fact that many of the Norwegian warriors present still wore no armor at all, having left it behind with the ships. Harald Hardrada positioned himself at the very center of this thin line, fighting beneath his personal banner known as Land Ravager, and when portions of the line began to falter under English pressure, he charged forward himself in a berserker-like fury, wielding both axe and sword simultaneously against the attacking English soldiers. Then, in a moment that would decide the entire campaign, an arrow struck him in the throat, and according to the sagas he fell to the ground almost instantly. Whatever the precise details of that final moment, what mattered for the outcome of the battle was simple and undeniable. The King of Norway was dead on English soil. The Norwegian shield wall held together for a brief additional period after his death, sustained by momentum and desperation more than clear leadership, but it soon began to fold under continued English pressure. Tostig himself took up Hardrada's fallen banner at this point and continued fighting on despite the obvious collapse unfolding around him, refusing any thought of surrender even as the battle turned decisively against his side. And he was eventually killed exactly where he stood, still holding the banner of the foreign king he had chosen to support over his own brother. As the fighting continued to rage across the field, fresh Norwegian forces suddenly appeared along the road from the direction of Rickall. Eystein Ora had arrived with reinforcements from the ships, fully armored and evidently furious at having missed the initial engagement, though already significantly exhausted from their own rapid march to reach the battlefield in time. This final desperate assault later became known in Norse tradition as Ora's Storm, and it struck the already battered English forces with genuine, unexpected force. For a brief, uncertain moment, the ultimate outcome of the entire battle seemed to hang in the balance once again as this fresh wave of attackers pushed into the English lines. But ultimately the sheer physical toll of the day proved decisive. The combination of oppressive heat, the weight of full armor, and accumulated fatigue from the forced march simply overwhelmed even these fresh Norwegian reinforcements, and one by one the attackers from Rickall collapsed under the strain and were cut down where they stood by the English defenders. By late afternoon, the field around Stamford Bridge had fallen almost completely silent. The battle did not end with any kind of triumphant celebration. It ended instead in scattered bodies and profound, bone-deep exhaustion on both sides. The greatest Viking invasion England would ever face in its history was effectively over in a single afternoon, but Harold Godwinson, for all his tactical brilliance that day, had actually won only half of the larger war still unfolding around him. When the fighting finally ended, there was no victory parade and no immediate celebration among the English ranks. The field around Stamford Bridge remained eerily silent, littered with the bodies of men who had traveled an enormous distance from their homes only to die on unfamiliar English soil, many of them left unburied in the immediate aftermath as the surviving forces dealt with more pressing concerns. The losses suffered by the Norwegian invasion force were genuinely catastrophic by any measure. According to later Norse tradition recorded in the sagas, only around 24 ships proved necessary to carry the surviving remnants of the army back home to Norway, out of an invasion fleet that had originally numbered close to 300 vessels when it first crossed the North Sea. Whether that specific number reflects perfect historical accuracy or not, the underlying meaning remains unmistakably clear. This had been nothing short of annihilation for the invading force. England had successfully survived the largest and most serious Viking invasion in its long history, but the victory had come at a cost the kingdom genuinely could not afford to bear so soon afterward. Harold Godwinson did not return south through cheering crowds lining the roads, and there was no triumphal procession organized to mark the historic victory. His army was thoroughly exhausted from both the forced march north and the brutal fighting that followed, and his professional household troops, the elite core of his overall military strength, had bled heavily during the engagement in ways that would prove difficult to replace quickly. Then came perhaps the most bitter personal moment of that entire long day. Harold personally saw to the recovery of his brother Tostig's body from the battlefield, the very brother who had betrayed him by allying with a foreign invader, the brother who had ultimately died on that field while stubbornly refusing any offer of mercy or reconciliation. Despite everything that had happened between them, Harold ordered that his brother be buried with appropriate honor rather than left among the other fallen. There was no real time available for extended mourning, however, because the king could not afford to rest on his hard-won victory. He did not pause to reorganize his depleted forces properly, and he did not have any meaningful opportunity to replace the substantial losses his army had just suffered. Within just a few days of the battle, his surviving army was already turning back south again, because England had won one decisive battle in the north. But the entire kingdom had been significantly drained by the effort required to achieve that victory, and history, as it turned out, was prepared to offer no meaningful pause before delivering its next test. Less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, another fleet appeared along the southern coast of England, and this time the threat came not from Vikings but from Normans under Duke William. While the bodies from Stamford Bridge remained barely cold in their graves, an entirely second war was already beginning to unfold for an exhausted kingdom that had precious little left to give. In a very real historical sense, Stamford Bridge marked the definitive end of an entire era. After 1066, the great large-scale Viking invasions of England that had characterized so much of the previous few centuries simply stopped occurring. There would certainly still be smaller raids in subsequent years, and there would still be bloodshed along various coastlines, but never again would a northern Scandinavian king personally cross the sea with a major army specifically to claim the English crown through outright military force. In that specific and meaningful sense, the Viking Age in England effectively died on that particular field near the bridge. Yet history proved remarkably cruel in its precise timing that autumn. The very same battle that had permanently destroyed the Viking threat to England also left the kingdom dangerously exhausted at the worst possible moment. Its most experienced professional soldiers had been spent in the fighting at Stamford Bridge. Its king was physically strained and psychologically drained from the incredible pace of the preceding weeks, and critically he found himself completely out of time to properly prepare for what came next. Stamford Bridge had genuinely saved England from one existential threat, but in doing so it had simultaneously made the kingdom acutely vulnerable to another. Only days after the northern battle concluded, the fundamental direction of the threat facing England shifted entirely, moving now from the north down to the south instead. What followed in the weeks after was not simply another raid in the familiar Viking style, but an altogether different kind of warfare, one built methodically around logistics, disciplined cavalry formations, careful preparation, and patient strategic planning rather than purely personal heroism on the battlefield. Stamford Bridge, in this larger sense, did not actually end the broader conflict engulfing England in 1066, it merely changed the fundamental shape that conflict would subsequently take. The deeper military lesson embedded within this entire sequence of events remains both brutal and strikingly timeless even today. Personal courage alone, however impressive on an individual level, does not reliably win extended military campaigns by itself. Heroic individual charges, however dramatic and memorable, cannot fully substitute for reliable supply lines and proper logistical planning. And individual brilliance in combat, no matter how exceptional, ultimately cannot overcome the combined, unforgiving pressures of geography, available time, and simple physical exhaustion. Harold Hardrada did not lose the battle at Stamford Bridge because his warriors somehow lacked sufficient bravery or fighting skill. They lost primarily because their forces had been carelessly divided between the battlefield and the ships at Rickall, because many of them had marched and fought without proper armor in oppressive late summer heat, and because their earlier victory at Fulford had convinced them prematurely that the entire northern campaign was already essentially won. When Hardrada finally fell on that field, something considerably larger than just one individual king died alongside him that day. An entire traditional model of warfare effectively died with him as well, one built fundamentally on the belief that the course of history could be reliably bent through heroic individual action alone, without sufficient regard for the grinding practical realities of logistics and endurance. Harold Godwinson, for his part, won unquestionably the greatest single battle of his entire life at Stamford Bridge that September day. And in achieving that remarkable victory, he simultaneously spent nearly everything of value that England still possessed in reserve. What happened on that narrow battlefield near the bridge did not bring an end to the violence threatening the kingdom that autumn. It merely redirected that violence toward a different enemy, coming from a different direction, arriving with unsettling speed. England still had one final, decisive battle waiting for it just a few weeks further down that same difficult road.